Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Welcome, my friends, to episode 24 of the Modern Leadership Podcast and another chance to sit down with a monthly book club author. We have been so fortunate to bring on the authors of the tremendous books we have been reading. And this month's book, Disrupt Yourself, Putting the Power of Disruptive Innovation to Work, is the perfect book for us to deep dive into as business owners and leaders because it gives us permission. And not just permission, it actually encourages us to break the norm and build our own success curve, to be disruptive. Ironically, I finished this book a couple of nights back at 3 a.m. with a sick 5-year-old disrupting my sleep. Our guest today is Whitney Johnson. I first learned about Whitney a couple years back when her first book, Dare, Dream, Do, hit my Kindle. Fast forward to today, she is one of the world's most influential management thinkers, according to Thinkers 50, and she is a podcast host of the podcast Disrupt Yourself. Whitney, this book is awesome. Can't wait to jump in. How are you doing today?
I am fine. I'm delighted to be talking to you.
Well, it's great to always have the authors on and really deep dive into these books. We were talking in the intro that I think today most people just skim the surface of books and we're missing out on these deep things that we can learn and apply into our lives because we're just trying to do it so quickly. And speaking of quickly, I went through that intro kind of quick. What did we miss?
What did you miss? I think that was, it's funny that you asked that because I was thinking it was really nicely encapsulated. I am a big fan of short introductions. I think long ones are pretty boring. I mean, I think maybe the one thing you might have missed is that I am married and have 2 children, and we live in the eastern United States in the state of Virginia.
Well, wonderful. Now, let's talk about this book and being disruptors and doing things a little different. Now, when I was in grade school, I had a teacher that would always plead with me to stop being so disruptive. But today we're encouraging it. So what's going on here?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you were an early disruptor. So a disruptor is basically a silly little thing that eventually takes over the world, or at least their world. We're typically familiar with this idea in the context of a product or a service. So, for example, we know that Toyota disrupted General Motors and Netflix disrupted Blockbuster, and Airbnb is disrupting hotels, and Uber cabs. So from a product and service standpoint, it's a silly thing that people looked at and they didn't really take very seriously, and they thought it wasn't going to amount to much, and then it turns out it does. And so that's the basic idea of disruptive innovation. It was a term coined by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School and really codified in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma.
And that's what really intrigued me as I dove into this book is we start thinking about these companies we're all familiar with. We've got Uber, we've got Netflix. These are products that we use. And we look at how they came to be. I mean, how did they rise so quickly from obscurity and take on these giants? And it was really, as you said, they did something different. It was silly. It was something that people didn't take as seriously as they maybe should have, particularly when you look at Blockbuster and the cab companies. And now they're really dominating. And so we jump into this book, and the very first quote of the very first page, you quote Laird Hamilton. And for those who don't know Laird Hamilton, he's a big wave surfing champion. I believe he's a world record holder for the big waves. And you talk about this. You say, "We're all equal before the wave." And what does that mean?
Isn't that a great quote?
I love it.
So what do I mean when I talk about the wave? Let me give a little bit of background. So one of the things that I did when I was working through these ideas is I had worked with Clayton Christensen, who's at the Harvard Business School, and launching a fund that would invest in disruptive innovation, which I've just described, the silly little things that take over the world. And in the process of doing that work, I had this insight that disruption doesn't just apply to products and services and countries and companies, but it also applies to the individual, that individuals can disrupt themselves, and thus the title of the book. At the same time, as I was thinking through this, we were using the S curve that was described by E.M. Rogers in 1962 as a way for people to understand how quickly an innovation will be adopted. Now, if you think about the S curve, it's actually in the form of a wave. And so you know that with an innovation or when you learn something, initially you're at the bottom of the wave and the bottom of the S, and growth is quite slow. Then you move into the sweet spot, and that's when you're actually surfing the wave. That's the steep, sleek back of the S, where you're in this wonderful place of you're not having to work quite as hard, but things are just working. It's like this exponential growth. It's exciting. Your neurons are firing. That's where you want to be most of the time. And then at the top of the S, or the top of the wave, you reach this place of mastery where things become easy and things are automatic. But because you're at the top of the wave, you have the risk of falling off the wave because it's now crested, or your plateau becoming the precipice. So you've got this wonderful S curve, this learning curve for you as an individual when you're looking to disrupt yourself. So coming back to this quote, we're all equal before a wave. The metaphor for me is we're all equal before an S curve. We start at the low end, we then need to scale it, and then we jump to a new one once we get to the top. So you and I are all equal when we're looking to disrupt ourselves before the S curve, or as Laird Hamilton said, before a wave.
And the reason I love this is one of the metaphors that I like to use, and having gone to school in San Diego and taken up a little surfing myself, is I notice that there's three types of people in the world. There's those standing on the beach watching the waves. There's those out in what they call the impact zone that are getting beat up and pushed around by the waves. And then there are those out beyond the waves, and they're kind of sitting, waiting, in the sunlight out there. And the metaphor is this: 100% of the waves being caught, whether the surfers are good or bad, 100% are being caught in the impact zone. And so as I read this quote, and I said, we're all equal before the wave, but the reality is, in order for us to be equal, we have got to be in the water. We've got to be in the impact zone. So when that wave builds, we're ready to take it. And do you see something similar to that?
Absolutely. That's a terrific metaphor. I'm excited to listen back to our interview and be able to think about that some more. And the answer is yes. You can be looking at the wave. You can be thinking about it. You can be at the top of your current curve or your current wave and thinking, wow, that would be really great to try it. But you're not going to get it unless you're where you need to be. You're showing up in a way that you can actually be in a position to catch that wave.
And this S curve that we're talking about is fascinating to me. And as we were talking, a couple of ideas popped in my mind. And one is, as technology is advancing and as there's more competition out there, have we noticed a difference in that as the wave builds, that more competitors jump on quicker, as in the S curve, the part that goes up, the actual wave of it, is that getting smaller because of competition? I mean, shorter time?
Absolutely. So we absolutely know that the pace of change is accelerating. And so these S curve, I mean, you can look at lots of different technological innovations, like the adoption of mobile phones in the developing markets. You see, it took in the United States, I don't remember exactly, but like 20 years. And then you go to an emerging market like Mexico, and it took half the time. And you go to Africa, and it took even less time. And so you do see the slope of the S curve getting much, much steeper. What I've done, and one of the reasons I've written this book, is my premise is that you and I as individuals don't need to cope with disruption. We know it's going to happen. The whole purpose of this book is to allow an individual to actually harness disruption, to look at it and say, okay, now I have a toolkit. Now I'm equipped as a leader to be able to manage this change, to harness this change, as opposed to just having the waves come at me, tumble me, crash me around. I'm going to surf the wave instead of having the wave come on top of me.
And in the book, you lay out 7 variables: taking risks, playing to your distinctive strengths, embracing constraints, battling entitlement, stepping back to grow, giving failure its due, being discovery-driven, are ways that we can speed up the movement of individuals along that S curve. And, one of the things that I was noting is that if we had hours to sit down and discuss this book, I would love to go one by one and go through each one of these. And I really wish we could, but we don't have hours. And truthfully, I think the listeners need to just go out and pick up the book. I mean, they need to read it themselves and go through these and understand what they need to do in order to move along this S curve at a quicker rate. One of my thoughts, though, as you were talking, is now with technology and this competition, have we noticed that the first part of the S curve, the flat part, have we noticed it's been longer or elongated? And I'll give you a quick example. Maybe this will make my question make a little bit more sense. 5 years ago, if you started a blog and then you just pushed it out to the world and you had people signing up for your email letter, you had people signing up on your Facebook groups, all sorts of things. Now, though, because there's so many people on that bottom part of the curve, you can't just put out a blog post. Now you have to disrupt again. You have to do something different. And so my question is, now as, competition has increased, have we noticed that bottom part of the curve, the very initial flat part, has that been elongated or is it about the same?
That's a really interesting question that you posed, Jake. And I don't know the answer, but let's I think we might be able to get to an answer. One of the things that I don't know if it's been elongated, because what I would say is my hunch is that it's really just that it's become more competitive, meaning when you think about going to a new S curve and improving your odds of success, if you're willing to follow these steps of disruption, then your odds of success are 6 times higher, your revenue opportunity 20 times greater. I think what's happening with people being in the social sphere, whether they're launching a blog, whether they're launching a podcast, is that there's now a lot more competitive risk versus market risk. And I think that's what you're describing here. And that's really the first accelerant of the framework of personal disruption, is to take the right kinds of risks. We talk a lot about wanting to take on risk, but most of the time we're thinking about competitive risk. So we look at it and we think, wow, there's 10 other people blogging on this topic. This looks like a really great topic. There's huge demand for it. All these people are doing it. I'm going to do it too. I'm going to write about this topic. And not realizing that by writing about this topic that 10 other people are writing about, you're taking on competitive risks. There's a lot more noise. It's going to be a lot harder for you to get noticed than if you're willing to say, you know what, I'm going to blog about something or do a podcast on a topic that other people aren't talking about. And so I don't know if there's going to be a market for this topic. I don't know if people are going to be interested in what I have to say. But if it turns out that they're interested because I'm playing where no one else is playing, then the odds of this blog or this podcast or newsletter or whatever it is are much more likely to be successful. So I would say not necessarily has it elongated. It's just that within this social sphere, it's become more mature. And so we've moved into the realm of competitive rather than market risk.
And that makes our necessity to disrupt even more and more important. It makes it more vital for us if we want to stand out and break away from this competitive risk to really do something that's different. A couple months ago, I heard an interview with Andy Andrews, and his advice was, look at what everybody else is doing and run the opposite direction. And when I think about that and I think about disrupting myself, I often, as a small business owner myself, as a podcaster, as someone that's on this S curve myself, I often think to myself, how can I disrupt? How can I do, because it sometimes feels like everything's been done. And I would imagine that the guy Reed Hastings, when he was creating Netflix, said, it's all been done. How do you come up with that idea, that light bulb, that spark to see what everybody else is doing and run the opposite direction?
It's a great question. And I think you're right. We really have this tendency to say, well, if it were really a good idea, it would have already been done, or it has already been done. And I think that really the best place to start is to find problems or ideas or things that you're trying to solve that you haven't been able to find a solution for. And number one, and then number two, look at something that you actually are good at. And then number three, something that you want to do. So, for example, I think it's interesting, and just to turn the lens on you for a minute, I think it's a really interesting idea that you are doing podcasts where you're interviewing authors of books and having people work as a book club together. I hadn't heard of that. I think it's interesting, and I suspect your listeners really enjoy the discussion around a book, and then the work that you're willing to put in. You're not just slapping up an interview, which is what I do. I mean, I don't think I slap it up, but you understand what I'm saying, is that you're really doing this wonderful deep dive for people. And I suspect that is, at least to a certain extent, playing where no one else is playing, so that you can distinguish yourself and have people say, oh, I want to be here, and no one else is doing this. So that's interesting to me.
Well, and what makes it interesting to me is, as you say that, I didn't realize that was disruptive. You see, sometimes in life, as we're going about our business, something comes natural to us. It seems like a good idea. I know for me, I polled my audience. I put out a survey. What they said was, we love the book that you're talking about every week, but we need to go deeper. So I looked at how can we go deeper? And I didn't even realize that was a step towards disruption. Really, to me, it was just a natural progression of what I was doing, which I find fascinating.
And it often is, because one of the things that happens is that what feels obvious and natural and reflexive to you is oftentimes what is it's reflexive to you because it's one of your strengths. And so I think that's an important aspect of disruption, which is, number one, is you take the right risks, you figure out ways to play where other people aren't playing, and or where people don't want to play or haven't thought of playing. And that's really the first accelerant of personal disruption. But the second accelerant is to play to your strengths. And maybe it makes sense for us to discuss that a bit.
Yeah, that does. I think it's something we should dive into, especially because I have this great quote that's staring me right now on the computer from your book. It says, unfortunately, at the low end of the curve, when you're starting out, you're so overwhelmed by new tasks, new people, new information, that finding the right unmet need to fit your unique confluence of skills can be very difficult. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about.
It is. It is, exactly. Exactly, because, when you're launching a podcast, I mean, or anything really, right? You've got so many logistical things that you're trying to work through just to get it started, that you can get completely overwhelmed by the logistical aspect of it and forget to focus on what is the need that is not being met in the marketplace. And not only what is that need, but how am I uniquely positioned to meet it? Because you can come up with a lot of needs. Like, I can come up with a need that people need great photos of something, but I'm not a photographer. So I can't meet that need. And so sometimes we find needs, but they're not needs that we can meet. So we've got to find the intersection of those two.
Do you find, as you work with people, that the more they're involved in something, that it limits their ability to think outside the box or be disruptive? For example, I'm a podcast listener. For a number of years before starting my own podcast, I was fanatical about downloading everything and listening to everything. And does that kind of shape sometimes and limit our ability to think outside the box and do it differently? The fact that I've been so involved and so, fascinated by it for such a long time?
It can. So on the one hand, because you became an expert podcast listener, you were very familiar with the genre and know what people are doing and what they aren't doing. And so that, on the one hand, gave you an opportunity to see where there might be a niche that's been unexploited or unexplored. On the other hand, there was the risk probably that you were going to try to emulate, mimic people that you really admired. And so I think there's always a risk there. So you get sort of the benefit of best practices, but you have to figure out how to find your unique voice. So on the flip side of that, someone who might start doing something new that doesn't have best practices on their brain because they're coming at it as a complete novice, they don't have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of people who did it previously. On the other hand, they're more likely to come up with something pretty innovative and unusual because they don't think to themselves, well, this is how you're supposed to do it. A great example of this, and I think I mentioned it in Disrupt Yourself, if not in Dare Dream Do, is a woman by the name of CK or Athelia Woolley, who started a business called Shabby Apple about 10 years ago, which is an online retailer. And 10 or 12 years ago, online retailing was not a thing. What's interesting about that business is that if she had looked at all the best practices at the time of being a dress retailer, she would have done it completely differently. But she didn't really know how to sew. She had not ever been in retail. And so when she decided to start this, she said, well, I've never been in retail. I don't know that you're supposed to go get a wholesaler, so I'm just going to go straight online. And then when it was time to design the dresses, because she didn't know how to sew and because she was under a budget, she said, okay, I've got to pick 2 patterns and I've got to keep them really simple. And so she did all sorts of things that actually allowed the business to be successful because she didn't know anything about retailing. And so on the one hand, best practices are very helpful. On the other hand, not knowing anything can be very helpful too, especially when you're trying to disrupt. So the trick is to somehow embed best practices in the back of your mind and then be willing to say, okay, now I'm going to try to forget everything I know and be a beginner, be a novice all over again. And there's a great book out there that really talks about this idea, which is Rookie Smarts by Liz Wiseman, where she talks about the importance of being a novice in a situation and how beneficial it can be to you and your organization.
The story of the Shabby Apple is in Disrupt Yourself, and it's a very interesting story, but it kind of has 2 sides to it. And that is, you could be successful whether you're starting out in a new industry like she was. She didn't know how to sew. She didn't know about wholesalers. She didn't know these kind of things. And so she was able to do something disruptive because it was so different for her. She was thinking outside the box. On the flip side, it was probably a little bit harder for her than it would have been, and probably cost her a little bit more time and money because she didn't have the experience. It wasn't something that she was naturally good at. And so it goes to show that you can be successful starting out with little knowledge but passion. Also, you can be successful starting out with lots of knowledge, but as long as you're moving in that right direction, then you can build on what you have and get that momentum going. And then when that wave takes off, well, why, you're right there in the water taking it on, which I think leads us, Whitney, to a great discussion on this equal odds rule. And it's something that I love from the book. But for the listener, what is the equal odds rule?
It's a rule that says that the odds, so it's based in research that was done about what allowed an academic or a scientist to write a groundbreaking research paper. And so what they found is that the odds of a scientist writing a groundbreaking paper, one that was cited over and over and over again, which academics look to as a measure of how successful they are, were directly correlated not to how smart the scientist was, but to how many papers the scientist had written. So let me say that again. The success of the paper or success of the scientist was directly correlated not with how smart they were, but to how many papers they had written. And so it's called the equal odds rule because it's about your willingness to show up. So yes, you need to have a baseline level of intelligence and a baseline level of understanding about a subject. But what's going to distinguish you, what's going to differentiate you is how much you write. If you want to write a book and you want to have articles go viral, how much you get out there and make sales calls, how many people you approach, whatever it is you're trying to do, the odds of success are directly correlated with how many times you actually show up and do the work. And I find that incredibly comforting because I'm not going to be the smartest person in the room. In any given room, there are going to be people that are smarter than me or more educated even. But if work is the determining factor, I can work. And so I think for anyone who's looking to disrupt themselves, to try something new, this is incredibly inspiriting and encouraging.
And I love this. That's why I wanted to pull it out, because hustle, going after it, showing up, doing what needs to be done, the work is something we can control. It's something we can go out and do. If we want to be a writer, write. and don't just write one thing and hope that it goes viral, but write and write and write. And I love Grant Cardone in his book, The 10X Rule. One of the things that he hits on is nobody out hustles him. If the average person is tweeting 10 times a day, he's going to tweet 100 times a day. If the average person is writing 1,000 words today, he's going to write 2,000 words today. And the idea is if you're showing up over and over again, you're not only going to get better at it, but you're going to have lots of examples for people to refer back to when they start picking up on what you're doing. So I love that. Now I'm looking at the time here, Whitney, and we're not going to have too much more time. I must talk to you about one topic in the book, and that is you talk about it's important to dream, and it's important to know when to find a new dream. And I want to dive into this because how do we know when we get on this S curve that we're not just on a plateau, that there is going to actually be the wave, that there is going to be a curve? How do we know this?
It's such a great question. There's never any guarantee. One of the things that's important to be aware of is that, at least from the theory standpoint, when you're looking at innovations or products or services, I said earlier that the odds of success are 6 times higher, but that's from 6% to 36%. So there's still a 64% chance it's not going to work. It's just that that's a lot better than, 94% chance that it doesn't work. And so your question is, and I think it's an important one, is how do you know if you're on the right curve? And so I have 4 questions that I would suggest that you ask yourself, or anyone can ask themselves, which are, number 1, are you taking on the right risks? So are you looking at taking on market risk where you don't know if there's a market versus competitive risk? So if you can answer yes to that question, then you're on the right curve. Question number 2, are you playing to your strengths, to your distinctive strengths, the things that you do well that other people around you do not? And so that means if you're great at coding, if you're competing with 9 other coders, that's a strength, but it's not a distinctive strength. If you're great at coding and you're surrounded by 9 marketers, then your strength becomes distinctive. So you want to pair the right kind of risk with your distinctive strength. The third question you want to ask yourself is this curve that I'm on, is this activity that I've undertaken, is it hard but not debilitating? And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at it and you think, wow, this is daunting, but I feel so exhilarated. I feel alive. This is fun. I'm enjoying myself, like scaling, again, climbing that curve, climbing that, surfing that wave, then it's the right curve. But if you find yourself just kind of discouraged, thinking, I can't do this, or you're actually getting sick, and sometimes you'll see this happening to people on the job, then that's a signal to you that it's not the right curve for you. So again, take the right risk, play to your strengths. Number 3, is it hard but not debilitating? And then the fourth question you want to ask yourself is, are you gaining momentum? Are you finding that more people are reading your articles on average today than they were a year ago? Are more people listening to your podcasts on average than they were a year ago? Are more people buying their products today than they were 3 months ago? Whatever metric it is you're using to determine whether or not you're gaining success, gaining momentum. I guess the fourth, sort of another way you can look at it, is on the job. If you are discouraged coming home from work only 4 days this week versus 5 days, then you're gradually gaining momentum. Now, if you can answer yes to these 4 questions, right risks, play to your strengths, is it hard but not debilitating, and am I gaining momentum? Then what I would say to you is you stay on the curve. Persistence is required because you don't yet have enough information to know that it's the wrong curve. At some point you may, but for now it's the right curve. Persist, keep going, because the odds of success are going to be higher. And if at some point you decide this isn't the right curve, then it's time to jump to a new curve. But knowing that no S curve is ever wasted. Almost anybody you can talk to who is later in their life, they will talk to you about what they're doing currently, and they will cobble together all these different aspects of their life, and they will tell you that their success has been made at least in part by something that they learned from a failure, which I would say is when you have to jump to a new curve, sometimes we consider that a failure. And so again, no S curve is ever wasted, but if you focus on those 4 questions, they can help you determine whether you're on the right curve or if it's time to jump to a new one.
I've got to say, Whitney, wow. Those listening to this podcast need to hit rewind the last 3 or 4 minutes and go through those 4 questions, because I sit here as not just the host of this podcast, but as a listener as well. And I got to tell you, I'm walking through these in my head as you're talking about them, and they are spot on. And guess what? I'm sticking to this S-curve because I can answer yes to all 4 of these questions, and it's awesome. It's exhilarating. It makes me feel so great to have this kind of 4-step validation process. So all the listeners, hit rewind. That was awesome. I really appreciate that, Whitney. And I've got to let you go. But before I do, there's 6 questions that I love to ask every guest, a little way for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. And if you're ready, I'd love to go down a couple of questions with you.
Fine. Fire away.
All right. How about a book currently on your Kindle or bedside table?
I just downloaded Lights of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch, like literally downloaded it. And the reason I did is because Amazon recommended him because I love Brandon Sanderson and Patrick Rothfuss. So I love kind of fantasy. There's such great, compelling good versus evil stories. So that's the book that's on my Kindle.
And, you can learn a lot of business stuff. You get ideas. You talk about disrupting yourself. It's putting yourself in a different arena and seeing things from a different light. So I absolutely agree. How about best movie ever made?
That's so subjective. So I'm just going to tell you the ones that are timeless for me. And one is Sound of Music and the other is Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh, wonderful musicals. What is your leadership superpower?
I can name a person's gift. So if I can talk to a person for about an hour, and I think this is why I love to coach, I can come up with what they do best and who they are and something unique and magical about that person. In fact, as I'm telling you this, it kind of makes me cry a little bit. So I love that I have this gift.
I think that is a tremendous superpower. Thank you for sharing it. How about a motivational quote, mantra, or philosophy that you have?
Yeah, it's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Rings and jewels are not gifts, but apologies for gifts. The only true gift is a portion of thyself.
Wow. If you could leave just one leadership trait to your kids or the next generation, what would it be?
Honesty.
And the best book ever written?
Well, besides the Bible or Book of Mormon, I would say nonfiction, the most interesting, I have to on what has impacted me is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And then best nonfiction, a book that I loved and read in the last year is Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind. But in terms of in that genre, generally Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card.
Yes. Very good. Well, Whitney, I can't thank you enough for coming on the Modern Leadership Podcast to dive into your book, which is tremendous. The listeners need to pick it up. Where can they pick it up and how can we get in touch with you?
Oddly, Amazon is the easiest way to go. Any major booksellers. So thank you. I would love for people to read it and enjoy it and love to hear from you. And then you can also get updates on my podcast. So thank you for asking.
Wonderful. Again, I appreciate it, Whitney.
Thank you, Jake. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
I want to thank Whitney for taking the time to be with us today. She is right in the middle of a deadline for the manuscript of her brand new book, and she has her head down, giving her all. Then she breaks away for 30 minutes to sit down with us because she believes in what we are doing. She believes in you and me as listeners of the Modern Leadership Podcast, and she wants us to have bigger and better businesses and lives. And one of the ways that we can do this is through disruption. You need to pick up the book. It'll open your mind to opportunities not yet identified. And my biggest takeaway from today's episode is those 4 questions that we went through right at the end. And I mentioned it on the show. You got to rewind it. You got to go through it again. But what they are: take on the right risk, play to your strengths. And that's not just your strengths, but your distinctive strengths. So you got to understand what makes you different. Number 3 is it hard but not debilitating? can you move forward? Which is number 4. Are you gaining momentum? If you can answer yes to those questions, boy, I tell you, you're on that S curve. You're moving in the right direction. And so go out there, disrupt, and be successful. Now, right at the end of the podcast, there was a little bit of a connection problem. So everything, including how to connect with Whitney to get her newsletter and to pick up her book, are all on the show notes for this episode over at jakeacarlson.com/ML24 for Modern Leadership 24. And you can get there. Apologize about the Wi-Fi. We seem to have this as a recurring little problem as we go from Airbnb to Airbnb. Some of the Wi-Fis aren't quite as strong as the others. Also, as a reminder, if you're an elite achiever, and I know you are, join the Academy. 10x your business and your life. You have the power. You got this. So if you haven't visited the website in a while, check out all the sweet stuff that we've got going on over there. I will see you on the website. But until then, I want to wish you a great day, an even better life. Go disrupt yourself, and of course, stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.